Great to be with you. Important final conference of the SHAPE program. What I'll be doing in the next 15 minutes is to give you a bit of the background and the scientific justification why it's so fundamentally important and urgent to have sustainable development pathway analysis and assessments of transformation journeys to humanity's future on Earth, but then also to give you an overview of some of the ongoing and recent initiatives that kind of align and support this SHAPE agenda. I know that many of you are involved in these already, so I'll be walking through open doors for many of you, but I think it's quite good to kind of summarize and have a sense of direction of travel. And I think the direction of travel is very clear. We're moving from the shared socioeconomic pathway era into the sustainable development pathway era, and that we now need nothing less than socially, ecologically integrated, holistic people, planet narratives to guide science and development and initiatives and investments into the future. And the starting point, I think, is adequate to take one step back. In 2015, the adoption of Sustainable Development Goals was, in my mind, nothing less than a major milestone. The shift from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals has two very significant shifts in how we work and define sustainable development in the Anthropocene. Number one is that they're universal. The Millennium Development Goals were all about reducing poverty, hunger in the global south. The Sustainable Development Goals apply for all countries in the world. It's an entirely integrated global agenda. But the second one is that for the first time, we have an agenda that integrates people and planet in a serious way. We have aspirational goals on socioeconomic development that have to be held within scientifically defined or reasonably quantified boundaries for sustainability. So it's truly about planetary stewardship for the first time in human development. It all translated to the 17 goals. We know them well. Scientifically, we have tried to communicate that these cannot be handled as some kind of Swedish smorgasbord. They actually have a series of non-negotiables, the goals 6, 13, 14, 15, which are the planetary boundaries, within which we can have social, economic, institutional, the whole justice, equity, finance, and everything that goes with SDP analysis. But also, which I dare say inspired, I think, the establishment of the whole SHAPE network is the early days after 2015 that gave birth to the world in 2050. Jeff Sachs, Naket Iasa, a few others recognized that 2030 is, after all, just a milestone. It's a bullseye on a journey where we want to have a safe and resilient and stable landing zone for humanity way beyond 2030, and thinking of meeting the 2030 SDG targets while having continued delivery on the SDGs within planetary boundaries by 2050, to show that any investments today in delivery on the SDGs have to be socially, ecologically, and institutionally robust enough to be able to be persistent over time. And that is the basis. And I think we now see for the first time, thanks to SHAPE, a concretization of that analytical framework. Why is this so urgent? Well, it's because we have such an ample empirical and observational and analytical evidence that we are in a planetary emergency. And this is, of course, based on the fact that we have all the empirical, overwhelming evidence that we're in the Anthropocene. We're now the dominating force of change on planet Earth. The scale and the speed of interconnectivity is outpacing our ability to adapt and cope. And we're seeing more and more scientific and analytical, but also policy debates showing that we're moving deeper into what can even turn into a polycrisis, meaning that we have multiple crises occurring simultaneously: inflation, economic recession, geopolitical instability and war, energy prices rising, food insecurity, climate impact, and ecological change, which not only are occurring simultaneously at large scale, but they're also interacting and reinforcing each other. So that's the reality that pushes us very quickly towards an SDP agenda. I share this with you for your eyes only, because this is not published yet, but it's the third update of the Planetary Boundary Science, synthesizing all the research that has been advanced since 2015, showing that 6 of the 9 boundaries are now outside of the safe operating space, which means that there is no safe landing on climate without also bringing back the resilience of the biosphere boundaries in particular. And we are unfortunately in the red on both freshwater, land, overloading of nutrients, and biosphere integrity. So there's no doubt that the planet as a whole needs to now be managed in a sustainable development fashion. And even the IPCC now concludes that very clearly. I mean, this is just a copy and paste from the 6th assessment report now in 2021, showing not only that we are threatening already today human well-being, but also the health of the planet itself. So the stability of the planet is today at risk, and that the window is rapidly closing. But what I find most reassuring with the IPCC assessment is that it also emphasizes today that safeguarding the functions of the other planetary boundaries, biodiversity, ecosystems, and land systems, are equally important and fundamental for a safe landing also on climate. So it's not surprising that we have initiatives from, for example, led by the Club of Rome, but we at PIC have been engaged in providing the scientific inputs for this, showing that we need to recognize that we have a climate crisis, an ecological crisis, a global pandemic crisis, and a geopolitical crisis that interact, giving us elements of what we can call a planetary emergency, which needs a planetary emergency plan, which is transformations. But when you think of transformations, just to give you one piece of evidence that we all work with literally every day, which is the fact that we know we have to follow the carbon law of cutting global emissions by half every decade, the Fit for 55, the net zero carbon world economy by 2050, which is the pink line you see here. But of course, the big drama in terms of reminders is that when we look back in history, and here you see a graph from Exeter University back to the 1930s, you know, even during the Second World War and the collapse of communism, you know, we barely came up to the pace of change we now need to see over the coming 30 years to occur in an orderly way that still delivers prosperity, equity, and poverty alleviation. So we're talking revolution pace, but in a way that benefits humanity, in a way that provides the sustainable development future we all have signed up to. And moreover, we know that it won't be enough. It won't be enough to succeed with that fossil fuel phase out, the gray curve here on following the carbon law. We also need the food system transition from source to sink, from dark brown to orange. And we also need to maintain the carbon stocks and sinks in intact nature on land and green, and the functions in the oceans in blue. And not even that is enough. A safe landing for a 50% chance of holding 1.5 will require what I could almost call fantasy level today, but incredibly optimistic levels of scaling of carbon dioxide removal technologies, the yellow wedge here. So we're in for a ride, and it's urgent, and the window is rapidly closing. And we know that every year that passes now makes this more and more difficult. So transformation pathways is the kind of the line of the day. That's where we need to move. So it's not so surprising that already the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, led by Jeff Sachs and colleagues, published the 6 transformation pathways to deliver on the Sustainable Development Goals already, 2017. We have the Peter Messely work from the UN, which is part of the Secretary General's efforts of trying to keep the momentum on delivery on the SDGs, identifying transformation entry points, which align very much. I mean, we come back to this time and time again, the food system transition, the energy transition, a circular economy, the urban development in a socially and ecologically sustainable way, and very strong emphasis on gender, equity, and human well-being. It comes back in different shapes and forms, but basically we come align quite nicely here. And I think Detlef van Vuren is with us today. This incredibly important paper that you led with colleagues in the SHAPE network on defining a target space to guide the kind of work that SHAPE is doing for transformation scenarios, which I think is one way of helping the analytical work towards the quantifications of what works and what does not work in these transitions. Last year at the New York Climate Week, we hosted the first Global Futures Conference together with Arizona State University to embark on a project which is incredibly challenging, which we call the 10 must-haves. The charge here was basically to say, well, we are in a situation where we need to consider seriously a plan B, that if we're failing on incremental policymaking, we need to really pull the brakes and think through where are the big decisions that we may have to take to avoid unmanageable futures. And this is ongoing work, and it aligns very much with the discussions that the Messerly and the Sachs reports have been having before. We've done a recent deep dive in this, as you may know, on the food system with the Eat Lancet Commission work, trying to quantify healthy diets from sustainable food systems. That translates to what we call the planetary health diet, which of course arises from the fact that we know that the food system in itself is the single largest cause for transgressing planetary boundaries. So if we, to put it simple, the energy transition and the food transition, which is very much at the center stage of the SHAPE analysis, can bring us to a very significant extent back into safe operating space. That Eat Lancet Commission work on those sustainable development pathway scenarios showed, and just focus on the line furthest down here, which is planetary boundaries on the upper x-axis, if you want, and to the left, different combinations of investments in sustainable development food system futures, that nothing less than regenerative agriculture at scale, cutting food waste in half, and adopting what we call a planetary health diet is required to be able to come back into safe space. So that is just to show how large this challenge is. The order of my slides came a little bit wrong here. Here you have the rationale for the 10 must-haves. I'm happy to share some of that, because we will have a second update on this must-have initiative in the New York Climate Week in 2023. Which is very much on looking at turnarounds, and we have a publication coming out on the 10 must-have domains, and again they repeat themselves very much on food, energy, governance, investing strongly in equity and capacity development, and this is just to show how aligned these initiatives increasingly are. A recent further one that I think is significant in this context is the 50-year update of Limits to Growth, the Earth for All analysis, exploring for the first time a world economy and the finance system and demographics within planetary boundaries on two different scenarios. I'm just giving you an example of the Giant Leap, which is a sustainable development pathway assessment using the 50-year update on the World 3 system dynamics model, exploring again similar transformation pathways on equity, on energy, on food, on empowerment and wealth distribution, showing which I think the SHAPE work also shows, that this is not easy, that even if you deploy very optimistic assumptions on these 5 giant leap transformation areas, yes, we can bend the population curve, which you see up in the orange there. Yes, there is a reduction in social tensions, improvements in average well-being, reduced inequalities, but overall it is, barely keeping us within planetary boundaries. We can not reach 1.5 degrees Celsius. We hold it well below 2, but not reaching all the way back into a safe space. It's just to remind ourselves that these analytics are so important, showing the checks and balances on what adds up on the aggregate level to really hold us within the guardrails that we need to respect. Then finally, just to say that I'm really excited by the work of trying to take the Earth system science also into redefining the global commons and how that guides transformation pathways. SHAPE scholars, together with Tokyo University, we are redefining the global commons in the Anthropocene, defining them today not as just the big systems outside of national jurisdictions like Antarctica, but actually the biophysical systems that we all depend on for the stability and resilience of the Earth system. And this adds up, not surprisingly, to quite a messy picture across all the spheres of the Earth system. And what you see here is in the straight text are all the tipping element systems. So that the identified large systems like the Greenland ice sheet, the West Antarctic ice sheet, the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, that we today must consider being part of the commons that we need to incorporate in the transformation pathway analysis, because we're all dependent on them. It's a kind of a Wuhan equivalent on pandemics, where the Amazon becomes the equivalent in terms of let it cross a tipping point and it hits back on humanity as a whole. And this is also something that is increasingly being developed into frameworks of defining transformation pathways to keep the global commons within, let's say, intact state to support humanity. And finally, to close, the Earth Commission just released its first findings after 3 years of work, trying to quantify safe and just boundaries. We presented this work, Jyoti Gupta, myself, at the World Economic Forum just a few weeks back, which gives us even more scientific support for justice. So if 1.5 degrees Celsius is a physical limit, a boundary for safe Earth system boundary, then the just levels, the social scientists assess, comes much closer to 1 degree Celsius to avoid significant harm levels to communities across the world. I think this is the next step in much of the work that we're doing, including exploring levers of social transformations. And as you may know, there is now a tipping point assessment being prepared for COP28 to include both physical tipping points and social tipping points, supported by the Bezos Earth Fund and led from Exeter University, looking at levers for accelerated change. And it would be wonderful to learn more of how SHAPE is able to include such levers for acceleration, because I think that is where we are. We can see a lot of movement in the right direction in terms of technologies and policies and frameworks, but at the same time, we're not making progress at the aggregate level. And the question is, how can we get the positive transformations to start getting the ball rolling in the directions that we want, the transformation pathways that SHAPE is so central to. And with that, back to you, Elmar, I guess, and good luck with the conference. Looking forward to follow the deliberations. Thank you.